Blackshirts and Reds by Michael Parenti. Section: Free Market for the Few. Third World revolutionaries are branded as the enemies of stability. Stability is a code word for a society in which privileged social relations are securely entrenched. When popular forces mobilize against privilege and wealth, this causes, quote, instability, which is judged to be undesirable by U.S. policymakers and their faithful flacks in the U.S. corporate media. Here we have a deceptive state of affairs. What poses as a U.S. commitment to peaceful, nonviolent change is really a commitment to the violent defense of an unjust, undemocratic global capitalism. The U.S. national security state uses coercion and violence, not in support of social reform, but against it, all in the name of, quote, stability, counterterrorism, democracy, and, of late and more honestly, quote, the free market. When he was head of the State Department policy planning staff during the early years of the Cold War, the noted author George Kennan revealed the ruthless realpolitik mentality of those dedicated to social inequality within and between nations. Kennan maintained that a wealthy United States, facing an impoverished world, could not afford, quote, the luxury of altruism and world benefaction, end quote, and should cease talking about, quote, vague and unreal objectives such as human rights, the raising of living standards, and democratization. The less we are hampered by idealistic slogans, the better. End quote. Speaking at a briefing for U.S. ambassadors to Latin America, Kennan remarked, quote, the final answer might be an unpleasant one, but we should not hesitate before police repression by the local government. This is not shameful, since the communists are essentially traitors. It is better to have a strong, i.e. repressive, regime in power than a liberal government, if it is indulgent and relaxed and penetrated by communists. End quote. In a 1949 State Department intelligence report, Kennan wrote that communists were, quote, people who are committed to the belief that the government has direct responsibility for the welfare of the people, end quote. So they had to be dealt with harshly, without regard for such niceties as democratization and human rights. It is said that the United States cannot renege on its commitments to other peoples and must continue as world leader. The rest of the world expects that of us. But the ordinary peoples of the world have never called for U.S. world leadership. Quite the contrary, they usually want the United States to go home and leave them to their own affairs. This is because U.S. commitments are not to the ordinary people of other lands, but to the privileged reactionary factions that are most accommodating to Western investors. As Kennan's remarks indicate, the U.S. policymaking establishment has been concerned not with advancing the welfare of impoverished peoples around the world, but with defeating whoever allies themselves with the common people, be they Reds or not. Whatever their grave shortcomings, do not U.S.-supported Third World rulers represent something better than the kind of tyranny that communists and revolutionary totalitarians bring? Academic cheerleaders for U.S. interventionism, such as Samuel P. Huntington of Harvard University, think so. Quote, however bad a given evil may be, a worse one is always possible and often likely. Huntington concludes, going on to defend as lesser evils the murderous regimes in Chile under Pinochet, and South Africa under apartheid. We might recall Jeane Kirkpatrick's distinction between, quote, benign authoritarian right-wing governments that supposedly are not all that brutal and allow gradual change, and horrid totalitarian left-wing ones that suppress everyone. The real distinction is that the right-wing government maintains the existing privileged order of the free market, keeping the world safe for the empowered hierarchies and wealthy classes of the world. In contrast, the left-wing, quote, totalitarians want to abolish exploitative property relations and create a more egalitarian economic system. Their favoring the have-nots over the haves is what makes them so despicable in the eyes of the latter. U.S. leaders claim to be offended by certain features of social revolutionary governments, such as one-party rule and the coercive implementation of revolutionary change. But one-party autocracy is acceptable if the government is rightist, that is, friendly towards private corporate investment, as in Turkey, Zaire, Guatemala, Indonesia, and dozens of other countries, including even communist countries that are sliding down the free market path, such as China. We might recall that unforgettable moment when President George Bush, whose invasions of Panama and Iraq brought death and destruction to those nations, and who presided over a U.S. military empire that is the single greatest purveyor of violence in the world, lectured revolutionary leader Nelson Mandela on the virtues of nonviolence, even going so far as to quote Martin Luther King Jr. during Mandela's visit to Washington, D.C. in June 1990. Mandela's real sin, in Bush's eyes, was that he was part of a revolutionary movement that engaged in armed struggle against a violently repressive apartheid regime in South Africa. Bush's capacity for selective perception had all the unexamined audacity of a dominant ideology that condemns only those who act against an unjust status quo, not those who use violence to preserve it. It would have come as a great relief to people around the world if the President of the United States had adopted a policy of nonviolence for his own government. In fact, he had done no such thing. End of section.